What do you think ruins most marriages? Cheating money or the mother-in-law who is just giving friendly advice? Sounds reasonable, but very often the real culprit is not even a person, it is the law. In every marriage, there is always a hidden third character, invisible. Not in the wedding photos, not sending a gift, but somehow it gets to decide whether you are allowed to get married, who you marry, where you marry, and sometimes whether you are allowed to back out even after you already regret everything. Throughout history, governments around the world have tried to manage love with laws, and when romance crashes into bureaucracy, the results are usually very weird. In this series, we are going to explore 31 real marriage laws that once existed or technically still exist on paper. They sound like jokes, but they were enforced completely seriously. And the first story will make you hear "Until Death Do Us Part" very differently. Story 1. Marrying the Dead. France. Imagine attending a wedding where everything is ready, guests are seated, music is playing, and the only thing missing is the groom. Not because he ran away, but because he already died. Sounds like dark humor, but in France this was once completely legal. The law allowed someone to marry a deceased partner as long as they could prove that both of them genuinely intended to get married before the death. And here is the wild part. You do not just file paperwork at the registry office, you have to ask permission directly from the president. Yes, the head of state personally reviews your love story and decides whether it was serious enough. The marriage does not come with full rights, but it is still officially recognized, which makes the phrase "until death do us part" sound a little outdated. Here, death just makes the paperwork slightly more annoying. Story 2. You're not allowed to marry the same person. Too many times, Kentucky. Everyone's had that one ex you swore you were done with, and then you got back together. And then again. And again. Well, apparently the state of Kentucky got tired of watching that movie on repeat. Over there, you're allowed to marry and divorce the same person up to 3 times. The first 3, the government politely pretends to believe, okay, maybe this time is different. But the 4th time, the state officially steps in and says, nope, we're not enabling this anymore. Picture the couple walking into the marriage license office full of hope. The clerk checks the records, sighs, and tells them the system won't allow it. Not because of missing paperwork, but because you two have already tried this too many times. This law basically turns the government into the most clear-headed friend in the group, the one who watches you go back to your toxic ex for the 4th time and says no, absolutely not. We're done here. Story 3. Marrying your cousin. But only if you are really old, Utah. In a lot of places, marrying your cousin is already controversial. Utah did not ban it outright. Instead, the law added one very specific condition. You are only allowed to do it if both people are over 65. If you are young and genuinely in love, the law says no. But if you are past retirement age, the state basically looks at you and goes, well, at this point, there is not much left to worry about. The logic is practical and a little cold. As long as both people are past childbearing age, genetic concerns are considered off the table. Morality here is not measured by feelings or family ties, but by biology. Imagine a couple showing up to apply for a marriage license, not to prove their love, but to prove their birth dates on paper. That is the moment you realize when the law tries to do math on human relationships, the result is usually very weird. Story 4. No divorce, Philippines, Vatican. In many places, marriage is a serious commitment, but there is always an exit called divorce unless you live in the Philippines or the Vatican, where that concept simply does not exist. Here, once you are married, there is almost no way out. You either keep living together or try to prove that the marriage was invalid from the very beginning in order to get it annulled. That process is long, expensive, stressful, and exhausting, to the point where many people start wondering if enduring a few more decades might actually be easier. Imagine realizing you married the wrong person and the law just smiles and says it is fine. Think of it as a lifelong lesson. In this case, the phrase "until death do us part" is no longer a romantic vow. It is a very accurate legal description where religious belief comes first and personal freedom is forced to wait in line behind it. Story 5. The law against nagging in marriage. New Jersey. Imagine being taken to court not for theft or fraud, but for talking too much. In old-time New Jersey, that was actually possible thanks to a crime that sounds like a joke called common scold. Basically, if a person, usually a woman, was considered nagging, complaining, or giving the neighbors a headache with her mouth, she could be labeled a public nuisance. not because what she said was wrong, but because she said it too often. This law turned the government into the referee of domestic arguments. It did not matter who was right or wrong. If you were loud and frequent enough, you were already halfway into legal trouble. It sounds funny, but behind it is a truth that is not so funny. The law reflects a time when society tried to control women by controlling their voices. When speech became a crime, silence was treated as a mandatory virtue. Story 6. Even joking proposals can be a crime, South Carolina. A proposal is supposed to be romantic, but in South Carolina, if you do it just for fun, things can get very unfun very fast. The law here says that if you propose to a woman without any real intention of actually marrying her, that act can be treated as a minor offense. In other words, this is not the place for fake proposals meant to prank friends or farm views online. Imagine getting down on one knee, opening the ring, saying all the sweet words, and then laughing and saying it was all a joke. The law in South Carolina will not laugh with you. It sees that as emotional deception. This law feels like a very clear message from the government: if you are going to kneel down, be serious. Because here the law chooses to protect hurt feelings, not failed romantic jokes. Story 7. Getting married without the bride or groom, present Montana. Imagine getting married while you are on a completely different continent. No flying, no FaceTime, not even putting on wedding clothes. In Montana, this can actually happen thanks to something called proxy marriage. In this type of marriage, the bride and groom do not need to show up at all. Instead, two complete strangers stand in a courthouse, say the vows, sign the papers, and officially get married for you. Legally speaking, you now have a spouse even though you have never stood in the same room with them at the wedding. It sounds like a scam, but this is a real law often used for military members or people who cannot leave their duty stations. Still, the idea that your marriage is represented by two random people is a lot to process. This story raises a pretty interesting question: is marriage a sacred emotional bond between two people, or just paperwork signed in the right place under the right law? Story 8. Getting married for fun can be annulled immediately, Delaware. Everyone has had at least one night where they made a bad decision, but if that decision was getting married as a joke, Delaware might be the only place on your side. Here, if you can prove the marriage happened as a prank, a dumb dare, or the result of one night of way too much drinking, you can get it annulled right away. No waiting, no messy divorce. You just have to admit, yes, we were not serious. Imagine waking up after a party looking at the person next to you and thinking, wait, did we actually get married? In Delaware, the law nods sympathetically and says, okay, this clearly should not count. This law is basically an undo button for marriage. It acknowledges a very human truth. Sometimes we do something stupid, and surprisingly, the law is level-headed enough to let you. Story 9. Forgetting your wife's birthday could also be illegal. Samoa, forgetting your wife's birthday usually just leads to a tense night on the couch. But in Samoa, legally speaking, it used to be way more serious than that. There was an old law stating that a husband was not allowed to forget his wife's birthday. In other words, remembering her birth date was not just a marital courtesy, it was basically a civic duty. Calendars, notes, and reminders in your head suddenly became a legal matter. Imagine a husband waking up, checking the calendar, and realizing he just made the biggest mistake of the year. In most places, he would just have to buy flowers late. Under Samoan law, he had messed up with the entire system. This law turned the government into an unwilling marriage coach. It sent a very clear message: if you want to be a good husband, start by remembering your wife's birthday. And if you do not be surprised when the law takes her side. Story 10. If you want to get married, you have to go hunting, old Massachusetts today. If you want to marry someone, all you need is a ring and enough courage. But in old Massachusetts, that was not enough. Before being allowed to get married, a man had to prove he could be a provider by going hunting. Not hunting deer or bears for glory. The law required him to hunt and kill a certain number of birds, like crows or blackbirds. In other words, marriage back then felt like a side quest. In a video game, complete the challenge, unlock the wedding. Imagine a future groom standing in the woods counting birds and thinking, just one more, and I get married. Love was not enough, you also needed survival skills. This law clearly reflects historical gender roles. Marriage was not just about emotions between two people. It was also a test of whether a man was capable of supporting a family. Romantic. Not really, but very practical. Story 11. Makeup was considered marriage fraud. England, 18th century, if you think catfishing only showed up after social media, people in 18th century England would like a word. Back then, makeup was not just seen as unnatural, it could actually be treated as marriage fraud. Under an old law, if a woman used cosmetics, perfume, wigs, or even false teeth to deceive a man into marrying her, that marriage could be annulled. In other words, makeup was treated more like witchcraft than beauty. Imagine a husband waking up after the wedding, looking at his wife in daylight, and thinking, wait, this is not the person I married. And the law nods in agreement. It sounds funny and terrifying at the same time, but behind it is a very clear message. Society believed women's bodies needed to be controlled, and natural beauty was not just preferred, it was legally mandatory. Story 12. Being drunk means the wedding can be refused. Scotland. Imagine you have made it through every wedding challenge, picking the venue, inviting guests, practicing the vows. All that is left is saying I do. Then the officiant looks at you, smells the alcohol, and says, no, not today. In Scotland, if the bride or groom is considered too drunk to understand what they are doing, the officiant has the right to refuse to perform the ceremony. No arguing, no negotiating. Drunk means legally not competent. It sounds reasonable until you picture someone who drank a little too much just to build courage and suddenly loses their spouse right there on the spot. The guests are seated, the cake is ready, but the marriage is postponed indefinitely. This law is a serious reminder that marriage is not just a ritual or a moment of emotion. It is a decision that requires clarity and real consent. And in Scotland, if you want to get married, you should probably put the whiskey down first. Story 13. You are not allowed to get married outdoors. England and Wales. If you dream of a romantic outdoor wedding with a gentle breeze, sunshine, and vows spoken in nature, England and Wales will gently pull you back down to earth. Here, for a wedding to be legally valid, the ceremony must take place inside a structure with a fixed roof. That means beaches, gardens, fields, or beautiful cliffs do not qualify. No roof, no marriage. The law does not care how blue the sky is or how deep the love runs. So the British came up with a pretty funny workaround: the gazebo. A small roofed structure placed in the middle of nature, just enough to satisfy the law. You are technically still outdoors, but legally not quite. This law is a perfect example of the eternal clash between rigid rules and romance. Love wants freedom, and the law only wants to make sure there is a roof over your head. Story 14. Women had to wait before remarrying. Japan. In Japan, after a divorce, a man could walk out of the courthouse and start a new life almost immediately. But if you were a woman, the law would politely stop you and say, wait a little longer. Under an old rule, women were required to wait 100 days after divorce before they could remarry. Not to recover emotionally, but to avoid confusion over who a child belonged to back in the days before DNA testing existed. Meanwhile, men did not have to wait a single day. Imagine two people signing divorce papers together. The husband can start planning a new wedding while the wife has to sit and count the days on a calendar. This law sparked intense debate because the inequality was impossible to ignore. It was a product of an older era when science had not caught up yet, and women were made to carry responsibility for problems modern society has already solved. Story 15. No minimum age for marriage, Massachusetts. In most of the United States, the question, how old do you have to be to get married, has a pretty clear answer. But in Massachusetts, the law once left a gap that made a lot of people uncomfortable. There was no absolute minimum age for marriage. Legally, if there was parental consent and a judge's approval, even a child could be allowed to marry. Love did not need to be old enough to drive it, just needed the right signatures. Imagine a courtroom where adults seriously debate whether a child is mature enough for marriage while the kid cannot even decide what to eat for dinner. The tension comes from the fact that the moral boundary is not written clearly into the law, but left to adult judgment. This law is an uncomfortable reminder that the law sometimes moves slower than society, and when it comes to marriage, protecting children should never be optional. Story 16. A wife could not cut her hair without her husband's permission. Today, getting a haircut is a very personal choice, but in the past, there were places where a wife's hair was not considered hers but her husband's property. Under old property laws, once a woman got married, she almost completely lost her independent legal status. Everything connected to her, from property to her own body, fell under her husband's control. And yes, that included her hair. Technically, a wife was not allowed to cut her hair without his consent. Imagine wanting a new hairstyle and having to ask permission like borrowing a car. It sounds ridiculous, but the more you think about it, the more unsettling it becomes. This law reflects a time when marriage meant giving up personal rights. It reminds us that many freedoms we take for granted today once did not exist at all. And sometimes personal freedom starts with very small things like having the right to decide what happens to your own hair. Story 17. The husband used to be the legal head of the household, Louisiana. If you think the phrase husband as the head of the family is just symbolic in old Louisiana, it was a legal rule. Influenced by the Napoleonic Code, the husband was once considered the lawful head of the household with the power to decide almost everything in the home. House's property and major transactions could all be signed and decided by him alone. The wife legally was treated more like a part of the household than an independent individual. Imagine living in your own home but having no right to decide whether to sell it or keep it. Not because you are absent, but because the law says you have no say. It sounds funny and uncomfortable at the same time, but what really stands out is how long this mindset lasted. It shows that the law has a long memory and old legacies can quietly last longer than a marriage itself. Story 18. Couples are required to share the same last name, Japan. In many places, changing your last name after marriage is a personal choice, but in Japan, the law does not really like that choice. When a couple gets married, they are legally required to use the same last name, and in more than 90% of cases, that name is the husband's. Imagine building a career, a reputation, an email signature, and even your personal identity around your own last name. Then after the wedding, the law simply says, now change all of it. Legally, the two of you are only allowed to exist under one single family name. This law has sparked debate for many years. Supporters say it preserves family tradition. Critics argue that it legally erases individual identity, especially for women. It sounds neat and orderly, but the question still lingers when you get married. Are you sharing your life with someone, or are you being forced to share your identity too? Story 19. Naming your child must follow an approved list. Denmark, in many places, naming a child is a moment for parents to be as creative as they want. But in Denmark, before you choose something truly unique, the government wants to take a look first. Parents are required to pick a name for their child from a pre-approved list. If they want a name that is not on the list, they have to submit an application and wait for a decision. In other words, a child's first name has to pass administrative review. Imagine excitedly suggesting a super original name and then weeks later receiving a short reply, not approved. Creativity gets stopped right at the birth certificate. This law is meant to protect children from overly strange names, but it also turns naming into a serious procedure. It raises an interesting question: where does individuality really begin if even your name needs collective approval? Story 20. The prince can veto your wedding. Monaco. In many places, the biggest worry before a wedding is the weather, or an ex showing up unexpectedly. But in Monaco, the biggest threat might come from the prince himself. In this tiny country, citizens who want to get married must publicly announce their intention for a certain period of time. During that time, the royal family has the right to review and object to the marriage if they see it as inappropriate. No long explanation required, just a simple no from above. Imagine having everything ready, from invitations to the wedding cake, and then getting the news that the wedding is canceled because the palace does not approve. Not because of a lack of love, but because of power. This law turns marriage into an application waiting for approval. It is a reminder that in some places, love is not just a private matter between two people, but something that still has to pass through the gates of authority. Story 21. If you knew there were issues and still got married, that is on you, Tennessee. Imagine walking into a marriage with full information. The other person has problems, you understand all of the risks, and you still choose to say, I do. In Tennessee, the law looks at you and gives a very short answer: no refunds. Under an old rule, if you already knew about your partner condition and still went ahead with the marriage, you had no right to seek an annulment later. No changing your mind, no turning back, no marriage warranty. Legally, you signed the contract with all warnings included. Imagine standing in front of a judge complaining that things did not turn out as expected. The judge only needs to ask one question: you knew beforehand, right? And that is where the story ends. This law sounds darkly funny, but the message is very clear. Marriage is not a free trial. If you walk in with your eyes wide open and still choose to proceed, the law believes you should take full responsibility for your own decision. Story 22. You are not allowed to censor each other books, New Mexico. Arguing in a marriage is normal, but in New Mexico there is a very clear line: you can argue, but do not touch each other books. Under an old and extremely bizarre law, spouses were not allowed to edit, tear out, or black out content in shared books, even during a Cold War at home. The law was written to stop angry couples from taking revenge on each other by destroying books, especially classic works like Shakespeare. Imagine a couple in a heated argument, one person holding a pen ready to cross out parts of Romeo and Juliet, then suddenly remembering, wait, this is illegal. It sounds ridiculous, but the law reveals an interesting priority. Culture and knowledge are protected more than temporary emotions. Here, a marriage can fall apart, but Shakespeare is absolutely off limits. Story 23. You might be married without knowing it. Kansas. Imagine waking up one day and discovering you are married even though you never had a ceremony or signed any paperwork. In Kansas, that is not completely ridiculous thanks to something called common law marriage. Under this system, if two people live together, consider each other spouses, and present themselves that way to the public, the law may treat them as legally married. No license, no wedding, just enough behavior. And the problem is, what exactly counts as behavior living together? Sharing a Costco card, calling each other husband and wife in front of friends, or just changing your Facebook status. Imagine breaking up and then realizing you need a lawyer, because legally you were never single. This story shows how thin the line between dating and marriage can be. In Kansas, you might slide from we are just seeing each other to legally married without ever realizing it. Story 24. You can sue the third party for ruining your marriage. In many places, when a marriage falls apart because of an affair, the person you blame is usually your spouse. But in some US states, the law gives you another very direct option: sue the other person. This law is called alienation of affection. Basically, you can take the third party to court and demand compensation for stealing your spouse's affection. Love in this case is translated into a specific dollar amount on paper. Imagine a courtroom where lawyers try to prove how much a human heart is worth and how someone else damaged it. It sounds funny and a little uncomfortable at the same time. This law is highly controversial. Supporters say it protects marriage, while critics believe emotions cannot be priced. No matter which side you take, this story shows that when love enters a courtroom, it stops being purely emotional. Story 25. Kissing your wife was banned on Sundays, Old Connecticut. In Old Connecticut, Sunday was not just a day of rest and prayer, it was also a day when you were not allowed to kiss your wife. This was part of the Blue Law's religiously influenced rules meant to keep Sundays absolutely pure. Under these rules, any form of intimate affection was considered inappropriate on the holy day. That meant even a light kiss after Sunday breakfast could technically be seen as breaking the law. Imagine a married couple standing in the kitchen suddenly realizing it is Sunday and quickly keeping their distance like they are playing a game of do not touch. It sounds funny and unbelievable at the same time. This law reflects a period when religion did not just guide spiritual life but also controlled the smallest gestures of private life. When faith became law, even marital affection had to take a day off. Story 26. Time-limited marriage, Iran. Imagine marriage working like a subscription service with a clear start date and expiration date. A month, a year, or even just a few hours. In Iran, this exists in the form of a time-limited marriage that is agreed on by contract from the beginning. In this type of marriage, both sides agree in advance on everything: how long it will last, what the rights and obligations are, and when the time is up, the relationship automatically ends. No divorce, no arguments. When it expires, it is over like a rental agreement. It sounds very practical, but this form of marriage is recognized both religiously and legally. Supporters say it brings clarity. Critics argue that it turns love cold and transactional. This story raises an uncomfortable question: is marriage a lifelong commitment or just an agreement with terms and an expiration date? Story 27. Holding hands in the wrong way can be illegal, UAE. In many places, holding hands is the most harmless gesture of love. But in the UAE, it can sometimes feel like playing romantic roulette. Sometimes it is accepted, sometimes it lands you in legal trouble. In principle, married couples are allowed to hold hands in public. But the line between acceptable and too intimate is extremely vague. Holding hands for too long, a slightly tight hug, or a quick kiss can be seen as indecent public behavior. Imagine walking around doing exactly what you would do back home and suddenly realizing the looks around you are no longer friendly. The law does not spell out every action, but the consequences are very real. This story is not about judging right or wrong, but about highlighting cultural differences. In the UAE, public space is tightly regulated, and love has to learn how to read the room before showing itself. Story 28. Even having a cold could get you banned from the city. Florence, imagine enjoying your honeymoon in Italy, leaving Florence for a day trip and coming back with a sniffly nose. In old Florence, something that small could turn into a real legal problem. Under an ancient quarantine law, anyone with a contagious illness was not allowed to enter the city. That makes sense for the plague. But technically it also applied to very ordinary things like a common cold or a mild flu. Imagine a couple standing at the city gates, one person sneezing, and the romantic trip suddenly turning into an entry issue. Not because of paperwork, but because of a nose. This law is a leftover from a time full of epidemics, but the fact that it still existed on paper shows a familiar problem when laws are not updated. Even a simple cold can become more serious than it needs to be. Story 29. An Elvis impersonator can legally marry you. Nevada, Las Vegas is famous for quick weddings, and nothing feels more Vegas than having an Elvis Presley impersonator officiate your ceremony. It sounds like a joke, but in Nevada, that marriage can be completely legal. The law here works on a concept called good faith marriage. If at least one of the two people genuinely believed the officiant had legal authority, then the marriage is still recognized, even if that officiant was just a guy in a sparkling jumpsuit singing "Love Me Tender." Imagine waking up after a Vegas night, vaguely remembering Elvis music and vows, and then realizing you are actually married. Not because the law is loose, but because the law believes in your belief. This story is peak Vegas energy, a place where anything can happen, and sometimes the law just needs you to honestly believe in the moment. Story 30. You were not allowed to get married if you depended on welfare. In many places, the question before marriage is, do you love me? But in some US states in the past, the government asked something far more practical: can you support yourself? Under old laws, if a person was considered dependent on public assistance, they could be denied the right to marry. The reason was simple and cold: the state did not want a new marriage to become a financial burden on the system. Imagine standing at the marriage license desk, full of emotion, and being asked about income workability and the risk of becoming dependent. Love barely had time to exist before it had to pass an economic review. This law sparked intense debate because it placed money above a basic human right. It turned marriage from an emotional commitment into a cost calculation. And the most uncomfortable question remains: if love is not rich enough, does it deserve legal recognition at all? Story 31. It's a getting married but not allowed if the purpose is physical. Wisconsin. If you think the law does not care why you get married, Wisconsin once proved otherwise. Under an old rule, getting married for temporary reasons or purely physical purposes could be considered illegal. The original goal was to prevent sham marriages, but the wording was so vague it created confusion. What does purely physical even mean? What if two people genuinely love each other but are also physically attracted? How much is love and how much desire before it becomes legal? Imagine a couple standing in court not being asked about money or paperwork, but being questioned about emotional motivation. A judge trying to draw a line between love and lust, two things that are always intertwined. This story shows a funny paradox: when the state tries to define human emotions, the result is usually not justice, but collective awkwardness. After these 31 stories, you have probably noticed one very clear pattern everywhere: the law loves to step into love. From marrying the dead being banned from marriage because you are poor, to having to explain whether you are in love or just physically attracted, the government never fully trusts people to love correctly on their own. Compared to all of that, marriage in modern America suddenly feels pretty relaxed. You can love, get married, break up, and start over without asking a prince for permission or proving your emotional motives in court, at least most of the time. But the question is still there: how far should the state go when it comes to the most private part of human life? Which law on the list shocked you the most, made you laugh the most, or scared you the most? Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and do not forget to follow the channel to keep exploring more strange stories from around the world.